We're going to talk about human intelligence and its evolution and the brain. Let's start with language.
We have developed a particular way of communicating that's quite different than any other species. And it has given us all kinds of secondary capacities that other species don't have. And yet, there are many respects in which we are not as good at many cognitive tasks, even than other primates.
Is language developed because of genetics?
Language is a really complicated relationship between communication and biology. And as a result, what we see is that to some extent, I would argue that much of what makes our brains good at language is the result of them having to keep up with the demands that language places on us.
If we were one of these science fiction movies where there are the aliens trying to invade, would that unify us?
Reverse dominance means that the group can oftentimes suppress the dominant individual. Well, the same thing is going to happen if we get invaded from the outside. And all these invasion movies that we see tend to sort of unify the human race. They come together and they beat off the aliens. But of course, they don't tell you what's going to happen 50 years later when they start fighting again. So what do we see in human history? Groups will cooperate with each other, give up their lives for each other to kill members of the other group. Language allows us to organize social groups of immense size. What we do best in organizing really large social groups is killing each other.
There's 6,000 different languages, and I wonder how all of this comes together.
So it clearly points out that we have an incredibly plastic ability to do this, that we can learn languages that have very different structure. We can use writing systems that are very different in structure. Now notice that writing developed only in the past 5,000 years or so, and differently in multiple parts of the world. And you take a baby from any place in the world and place them in another society, and they can learn that language.
Hello, everybody. Today we have an exceptionally interesting topic. We're going to look into human evolution and particularly to the evolution of brain and intelligence, why we're so smart. Okay, and so with me today, we have a very well-known anthropologist from the University of California, Berkeley, Terry Deacon, who is also the author of several books for the larger public, such as The Incomplete Nature and The Symbolic Species. So Terry, hello, how are you today?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you. I'm glad to be on here.
Okay, so I'm very happy. We're going to talk about human intelligence and its evolution and the brain.
Sounds good.
Let's start with language. Is this if you like, the highest or the most sophisticated cerebral function that differentiated us from the other primates?
So I think the error is to thinking about it in a vertical sense, that language is somehow the apex of something, or that we're the apex of evolution. We have developed a particular way of communicating that's quite different than any other species. And it has given us all kinds of secondary capacities that other species don't have. And yet, there are many respects in which we are not as good at many cognitive tasks, even than other primates. So chimpanzees, for example, are much better at sort of immediate learning of details. So you show them a complicated image and it disappears quickly. They can remember all the details in ways that you and I probably couldn't. So we have just specialized in this one area, but it turns out that the kind of specialization that language is does make us very unusual.
So is language developed because of genetics or only genetics? Where does it come from?
So I think it's a mistake to think of language as though it's like another appendage in which we needed major gene changes that just simply gave it to us by some sort of accident. Language is a really complicated relationship between communication and biology. And as a result, what we see is that to some extent, I would argue that much of what makes our brains good at language is the result of them having to keep up with the demands that language places on us, and that those demands cause changes in the brain. Those changes in the brain made us capable of doing more complex linguistic things, which put more demands on the brain. And so over the course of, I think, roughly 2 million years, both brains and languages sort of evolved together and drove each other in a kind of arms race between the two, in which both languages got more complex and brains got better at handling the demands of language.
So what epigenetic factors have contributed to the evolution of language in very simple terms?
One of the real challenges, we normally think of the evolution of some structure as though it's just building a plan, that the genes hold the plan and you got to change the plan and then it gets built. But in fact, brains are particularly sensitive to epigenetic factors. And that's because although we have about the same number of genes for building our brains as a mouse does, for a brain that's the size of the last digit of your little finger, we need information from some other source. Epigenetic processes of development, cells communicating with each other, even a kind of internal Darwinian process for building the details of the brain. So just in normal development, the genetic information is just the start. And it's epigenetic information, that is information of cells communicating with each other, of modifying each other, interacting in a way you might a little bit like social interaction to some extent, that builds a lot of the complexity of the brain. A lot of the information of the brain is built epigenetically.
So if we zoom out and we look at the human evolution and the evolution of our species, is there something that is absolutely an outlier compared to any other species on this planet?
Yes and no. Biologically, I would say we're just a tweaked great ape. Even our brains don't have any novel parts that other great apes don't have. The organization is a little bit different. The connectivity is a little bit tweaked. But in biological sense, no. And yet, brains have been evolving to an environment. And I like to think about it like you think about beavers. Beavers' bodies have adapted to the environment that they create every generation. Beavers have become aquatic rodents because of what beavers do to their environments, making them aquatic. Well, we have become linguistic primates because we've created this cultural linguistic environment that we've had to adapt to. But it's not our bodies so much that have adapted to it, but our brains have adapted to it. So we've been evolving to this sort of virtual environment that no other species has evolved to.
If communication is what makes us different in a way, are we likely to accelerate the evolution of our cognitive abilities?
That's a really tough question, in part because a lot depends on how well we are able to do exactly what you're describing. That is, what can we record from one brain that can be transmitted to another brain? I think we could, in fact, record impulses that would help us move electronic arms and robotic devices. Would also probably be able to record silent speech so that you could know what I'm saying, but probably not be able to record memories and transmit those. It turns out that they're very different in the way they're organized in the brain. And we have a very different understanding, I think a very primitive understanding of some of these other features of the brain. But as a result, would it change the evolution of humans? I have the sense that depending on how we do it, it could actually hold us back. It could even sort of simplify us in ways that, for example, getting stuck playing computer games simplifies people's cognition. You just don't have enough experience with the real world. I think that might be a possibility here as well. But again, evolution is a process that's much more complicated than engineering. And I think we're confusing engineering with evolution when we think in those terms. Now, I do think that the evolution of different forms of communication, writing being a good example, has radically changed human society. I don't think it's radically changed human brains or human experience, but it's radically changed what we can do, what we have been able to do as a species. Without writing, we wouldn't have had this ability to get information from hundreds of years ago and pass it forward. You know, our religions carry information from thousands of years ago into the present that still influences people in ways that they were influenced thousands of years ago when these ideas were first written down. So there's ways that it can slow things down, make communication conservative, but also can make communication additive. And so we can really accelerate things. So it has both effects. And so I think that any way that we modify the way human beings communicate to other human beings, it will have those effects, even if it doesn't have those effects on the structure of the brain, for example.
So on my channel, I have interviewed people that, at least they claim, and I know you might be very skeptics, that they have met beings from another planet that can communicate telepathically. So if we were in a reality where we have to communicate with other beings, would we like to develop communication skills that we do not have today?
It would have to be very different for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is the same reason that if you and I and 5 other people were talking at once, all to each other, it would be just totally confusing. total mess. So one of the things that has to happen if you're going to communicate brain to brain, for example, is that you need to keep a channel very limited so that it's not confused by diverse information and by diverse communications. So you have to have a way to tune out somebody and tune in somebody else in the way that we actually do with language, with face-to-face communication, or with sending an email to one person or to a group of people in one direction. But we recognize it always becomes a problem when there's more than one voice talking at once. The next thing about it is that language makes it possible to communicate between us, even though we have totally different experiences, even though our memories are radically different, because we share the same interpretive habits that make, in our case, the English language, the one that we're both using right now. If I was speaking in Swahili and you were speaking in English, and I didn't understand English and you didn't understand Swahili, nothing could get across. That's because all the habits underlying it, all the background information is encoded differently. So here's the problem with telepathy. The problem with telepathy is that we have to have a shared experience, deeply shared experience, like we have deeply shared communicative and interpretive habits within the same language. How do we develop that? Well, we each were immersed in the English language for long periods of time, maybe me longer than you, given that it's my first language. But in that process, we now share all of this in common to actually communicate telepathically at a deeper level than just like words. We really would have to have a massive amount of shared habits of experience so that when I send across a memory, it immediately clues up that same memory in you. But if you think about that, that's basically sharing a mind. Some people have called this kind of the hive mind logic, like the Star Trek Borg, for example, in which there's no longer individuality. But if there's no longer individuality, it's not quite the same as two people, you and I, communicating telepathically. It's a very different kind of situation. So I think the interesting thing is that we haven't really thought about the challenges, what it would be like. Doesn't mean that it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it would be a very different kind of thing than what's going on between us, for example.
And that opens the question whether we would like it or not.
Exactly.
That's
the whole story about the Borg. Your listeners know the Star Trek story about this sort of hive mind that develops, as people sort of assimilate. I mean, this alien civilization assimilates new civilizations, and people just become plugged into this hive mind, and they lose their individuality. I think that's what was necessary to do this. Now, that might be something that's very attractive. Would it feel good to be part of a hive mind? Because even though my body goes away, the hive mind persists. Would it be more like bees, where the workers are, happy to sacrifice their lives for the good of the whole?
We will discuss above top secret technological developments at the first Silicon Valley Conference on Secret Space Technology Business Applications. Experiencees and witnesses of advanced technologies will present how they have interacted with innovations and discoveries far beyond our current reality, but one day possibly becoming our reality. In this conference, we will discuss the futuristic civilian applications of these technologies to our economy. It is about time that we start challenging our current beliefs and limitations and start to envision a more advanced civilization for us and our children. One day, we may be using some of these secret space technologies to build viable civilian business applications.
Let's do this. Let's take now a step back and let's try to dig into this topic. So I would say let's start with the concept of human intelligence. I think the first thing really that comes to my mind is at the biological level, if any, how are we different from the primates, the chimpanzees, the monkeys?
So it turns out that there are no new parts to the brain. The human brain does not have structures that other brains don't have. Primate brains, mammal brains in general, have a remarkable conservatism. The very same genes with slight modification are building brains in all of these different species, some of them very small brains, some of them very large brains, but not a lot of difference. So when I teach neuroanatomy, for example, I begin with rat brains and then talk about cat brains and sheep brains. It's only when I talk about some really unusual brains, and human brains are not in this list, I talk about Sirenian brains, sea cows, dugongs, who have remarkably thick cortex, weird brains, and cetaceans, dolphins, and whales, who have huge brains that have very thin cortex and lack some layers of cells in the cortex. These are the real weird outliers. We are not one of those weird outliers in terms of our brain structure. And yet we have brains that are slightly different, or parts of them have slightly different proportions than we would typically find in one of these more conserved brains. And that has produced slightly different connectivity so that the circuitry in the brain is a little bit different. I think one of the other things that might surprise people to learn is that a lot of the, what you might call innate specification of the brain, the stuff that says, okay, wire up this way, don't wire up that way, build this thing up very specifically to do these tasks because it's going to be more complicated. In many respects, the control of the development of our brains has lost detail. And so that it's, in a sense, more flexible, more undifferentiated than many other brains. And I think that lack of pre-specification has actually aided the evolution of language, for the simple reason that language is not something built in. We need to be embedded in a social group where lots of people are maintaining this capability to communicate, these habits of communication. And how do they do it? How could hundreds of people converge on this pattern so well? They have to be really tuned into each other to keep it constant, so that when I come into the world embedded in this network, my brain can be strongly organized by virtue of the language that I'm acquiring. In fact, our brains, as a result, come into the world, you might say, expecting language, expecting to be in a social group that's communicating this way. We know this because people who are raised in non-human situations, isolated at birth, so-called feral children, never develop normally. They don't think like us, they don't act like us, and they usually can't acquire language at later ages.
This concept of self-domestication, what it is and why it's relevant when it's connected to human evolution as an whole.
First of all, we're not the only self-domesticated species. It's now pretty clear that dogs initially domesticated themselves. We only recently began to domesticate them for our purposes. But in fact, they were wolves, they're ancestors of wolves, that became capable of hanging around human groups, mostly probably eating our refuse. But in order to hang around as groups together and eat all the garbage that we've left around in our jumps, so to speak, they had to be less frightened of people, but also less aggressive with each other, because you can't share this great resource if you're always fighting with each other over dominance. So I think one of the things that happened is that dogs had to become a little less aggressive, a little less disturbed by human beings, a little more easily capable of integrating with other members of their species, and might even be strangers. But now let me put this in the context of people. In order to develop normally, in order to develop human cognition, I have to be in a social group that has maintained this means of communication, language. And it's difficult. Think of all the complex details that have to be acquired so that we can communicate. But what that means is that if somehow we human beings were not easily able to interact with strangers, not easily able to sort of get along and not fight over things, not be sort of driven for dominance, if we had really powerful instincts like that, we couldn't maintain a large social group capable of communicating like this. But that would set it up so that those groups that did a better job of having a larger group cooperating would actually have a better language. And that language in itself could help negotiate cooperation. It even gets more troublesome, though, because that means that now we can shift this competition from within groups to between groups. So what do we see in human history?
Wars.
Yes, we see the fact that groups will cooperate with each other, give up their lives for each other to kill members of the other group. So what's happened is, to some extent, those tendencies have been shifted up a level to the social group. Why? Because the social group is absolutely essential, but it's the social group that you identify with. And so identifying with a local social group that shares your habits, your culture, your belief system, and of course, your language is absolutely crucial. but those that don't are your enemies
So
automatically.
are you saying that we are intrinsically kind of a mafia species?
Well, we find many cases like this, not quite as extreme as humans. And that's, I think, precisely because language allows us to organize social groups of immense size. I mean, there's no other species on Earth that can organize the behavior of millions of human beings to act together on a particular task, language task, but also technological tasks, and of course, warfare. What we do best in organizing really large social groups is killing each other. We're good at it.
If we were one of these sci-fi fiction movies where there are the aliens trying to invade, would that unify us?
Generally, we tend to do that. In social systems in biology, we sometimes talk about reverse dominance. Dominance is when one individual, one strong, powerful individual, dominates and takes all the resources from others, gets all the females oftentimes in a polygynous social group, like in gorillas, for example. But what we find in some social groups is that reverse dominance can happen as well. The single most dominant individual, as an individual, can pick on anybody else, but he can't pick on 10 other individuals who are cooperating with each other. Reverse dominance means that the group can oftentimes suppress the dominant individual. Well, the same thing is going to happen if we get invaded from the outside. And all these invasion movies that we see tend to sort of unify the human race. They come together and they beat off the aliens. But of course, they don't tell you what's going to happen 50 years later when they start fighting again.
I still find it difficult to digest the idea that the genetics is not at the basis of the departure of human intelligence from the primates.
So we're absolutely different genetically in our nervous systems. But the idea that a particular simple genetic change could have produced this is probably the oversimplification we want to avoid. So let's go back to the beaver example, because it's a good example to talk about this. Beavers have had to adapt to an aquatic environment. Lots of parts of their body have had to adapt to this. They've got to have more webbed feet. They've got this flat tail. They're able to hold their breath. They're larger than most other rodents. And they have this special ability to digest the inner bark of trees, which is really difficult to digest. You have to eat a lot of it and you have to eat slow. It's all kinds of these things have to do with their adaptation. These are a lot of different little tiny changes and adaptations that were driven by this adaptation to this special environment. So now when you think about the brain, what's happened is that this environment, this social communication environment that requires so much contact between individuals, so much shared communication, so much shared interaction, has clearly demanded changes of the brain. So the human brain is fundamentally different. But it's not because some 1 or 2 or 5 genes has changed. It's probably that hundreds of genes have been tweaked just a little bit. A couple of them maybe are having a bigger effect, but there are many, many effects. And I like to talk about this not as a language adaptation, but as the set of language adaptations, all the things that make us capable of hearing the speech sounds, rapidly taking in the information of a speech sound, and understanding what the word is, understanding its meaning, but not remembering 5 seconds from now what was just said. One of the things that happens is, of course, the information goes in and it's immediately translated into meaning. We lose track of this altogether. These are specializations, tweaks of the way normal primate cognition works, but lots of little tweaks that make us so that collectively we can do this radically different thing. In fact, almost the entire cerebral cortex, we now think, is involved in analyzing the meanings of words and speech. We used to think it was just a couple of areas of the brain that were critical for doing this. We're now pretty clear that the entire cerebral cortex, probably both hemispheres, is intensely involved in analyzing the meanings of things. That means that since none of those parts of the brain have been radically changed from their primate prehistory, what's happened is, in a sense, every part of it's been tweaked just a little bit so they can do what those parts of the brain have always done in other primates, whether it's sound analysis, visual analysis, or motor activity and so on. But they've been tweaked to be able to do that and also take on some little sub-function of the language capacity. So rather than saying that, no, genes made us do it, genes followed the demands, trying to adapt to the special conditions and tried to keep up with this process. And over the course of I think about 2 million years, where we have seen during this period of time that human brains have gotten larger by almost 3 times. During this period of time, it's also been tweaking along the way. Size is part of that tweaking, but it's not the whole story. And it's not just a few genes. And the genes didn't start it. The genes just recorded the changes that had to be made.
If you look at a primate, when they're born, they have about 70% of the brain ready. And within the first 6 months, the brain is completely developed. And then they said that human beings instead have only 40% of the brain ready. And that before it reaches another percent, it takes 20 years. And one of the things that we're saying is this a evolutionary advantage?
So it is indeed the case that we're born at a very immature stage. And one of the things that we've noted is that the rate of brain growth, a really surprising finding, is that the rate of brain growth is identical across placental mammals. Brains don't grow faster in us, but they grow longer. It takes longer to get there. And since it takes longer and it's a multiplicative process, it accelerates and accelerates and accelerates. Primates, on the other hand, grow their bodies in the womb slower, so that at every stage, their bodies are smaller compared to their brains. But for whatever reasons, and we can't quite figure it out yet, brains are growing at a very conserved rate in all placental mammals. Now, I happen to think that that's because placentation is this perfect place. You get everything you need to grow at an optimal rate. And so why shouldn't brains in placental mammals being growing as fast as they possibly could? This may be the upper limit of the rate of brain growth. The next thing that we found out is that for the size of the mother, we human beings are born at just what you'd predict for a primate of our size. We're not born too early. Gestation isn't shortened. But what has happened is that because brains are growing over a longer period of time, they're more immature at the same stage. It's as though our brains are growing in a body that's going to be about a ton of weight, about 2,000 pounds. Our brains are growing as though they're in a body of a giant ape. The result is that everything about brain development and brain growth is as though we're in a much larger animal that would take much longer to mature. Now, that's clearly a factor. What it does mean is that there's going to have to be much more caretaking of the young, much more cooperative care to raise young that are very immature and having a tough time getting along.
It seems that Homo sapiens appeared 200,000 years ago. It means that our biological development was complete. I mean, if all the rest comes from the domestication, where does the domestication come from?
Human beings left Africa and spread over the old world, walked all the way to Java, and because sea level was low, at 1.8 million years ago. This is a long time ago. And they had this thing called, today we call it a Swiss Army knife, but it was basically this single stone tool. We called it a Schulian tool, a hand axe. People using this tool had basically left Northeast Africa and wandered all the way over the old world. They weren't probably as developed as they were 250,000 years ago or so, but clearly this has been possible. In fact, one of the things I like to say is the most successful hominin species was not Homo sapiens. The most successful hominin species was Homo erectus, sometimes called Homo ergaster. Homo ergaster lived all over the old world using the same technology for the most part, with just slight tweaks for well over 1 million years. So being stable, surviving on this wonderful adaptation they developed, a social adaptation, they had to work together because they had to forage on foods that they could out the competing carnivores on. They had to work together to do this. That started close to 2 million years ago. We got better and better at it. And as we got better and better, our brains got bigger. They got slightly reorganized. We produced better ways of communication. And it's pretty clear that our ability to speak took longer to develop. We have a pretty good sense that our ability to speak is probably only a little over 500,000 years old. We have a sense of this because of some genetics. We know that a gene called FOXP2, which is shared with Neanderthals, which makes articulate vocalization much easier and is different than in other species of primates or mammals, seemed to already have been modified over 500,000 years ago when human beings and Neanderthals separated off. That suggests that already by more than 500,000 years ago, we were communicating not just by hand gestures and other things, but by actually vocal communication.
We will discuss the advanced top secret technological developments at the first Silicon Valley Conference on Secret Space Technologies Business Applications. Experiences and witnesses of advanced technology will present how they have interacted with innovations and discoveries far beyond our current reality, but that may one day become our reality. In this conference, we will discuss the futuristic civilian applications of these technologies to our economy. It is about time that we start challenging our current beliefs and limitations and start to envision a more advanced civilization for us and our children. One day, we may be using some of these secret space technologies to build viable civilian business applications.
Tomorrow, we can live 200 years instead of living 70 or 80 years. Will we be socially different?
Yeah, I doubt that it'll be better for us. In fact, I think that it will be so disruptive that we might be worse off. And here's what I mean by that. And this is not a linguistic question. It's not a question about domestication. It's actually a question about this relationship between age classes, age groups. So what happens when I don't retire for 50 years and some youngster can't get the same job, can't step in until they're 70 years of age? What are they going to do all that time? It's going to be very uncomfortable. So one of the things that's happened is that over the course of our recent history, our social structures have actually adapted to this sort of typical lifestyle and timing of life stages. If this changes very subtly over time, we'll probably adapt to that. But if it was changed because we figured out some genetic tweak, well, obviously, if it happens over a short period of time, it's going to be incredibly disruptive socially. And I think that will just simply bring out more trouble. I'm not suggesting that it's a bad thing, but I am suggesting that it will have to do a whole lot of more very careful social engineering to go along with this if we figure out how to extend lifespan.
There's 6,000 different languages. And I wonder how all of this comes together. Like, it's hard to believe that there is not a genetic, strong component behind it.
So it clearly points out that we have an incredibly plastic ability to do this, that we can learn languages that have very different structure. We can use writing systems that are very different in structure. Now, notice that writing developed only in the past 5,000 years or so, and differently in multiple parts of the world. So we have logographic systems, we have syllabic systems, and we have phonetic systems like in European languages. And yet, most human beings are capable of learning to read and write. There hasn't been enough time for there to be brain evolution to learn to do writing and to read. And yet we can do it. And that tells us that we have this incredible flexibility. That again suggests that plasticity is a really important thing, that we want to not build in a lot of very precise predispositions, but we want to have the capacity to do a lot of diverse things. So that's one of the reasons why languages can be so diverse around the world. And you take a baby from any place in the world and place them in another society, and they can learn that language.
We have seen what it is in 2006, 2008, the emergence of this thing called social media. Do you think that's enough of a strong signal to alter the way the brain works?
It's not going to change the evolution of the brain, but it's going to alter the tweaking that the epigenetics of the brain utilizes. In the same sense that learning to read and write, becoming literate, actually changes the way people think. It changes the way we think about certain sounds of language. For example, it's now been demonstrated that people that don't have a syllabic writing system or don't have a phonetic writing system actually think about the sounds of language differently. Well, a similar thing we could say like that will be happening with social media. If we're constantly, from a very, very young age, being educated by social media, it's going to have the same kinds of effects. We don't know what they will be. That's the problem. It's hard to predict. That doesn't mean that it's going to change their brains in any kind of evolutionary sense. What I would suggest is if you took somebody from 1,000 years ago in, say, Mongolia, you took this baby and you put him in a time machine and brought him to the present and stuck him in front of a computer screen, learning to play with a mouse or whatever, to play with a game or even use his brain to do it. I have no doubt that that child would do as well as any modern child.
Based on your experience and your research on the brain, is there any organ or any part of the brain that is kind of difficult to explain?
The pineal gland has been a focus of this in mysticism for a long period of time. Even in Asia and South Asia, in sort of some Hindu traditions, it was thought of as a third eye, for example, in the middle of the head, because it has a structure that looks a little bit like an eye. The pineal gland was also the part of the brain that the philosopher René Descartes thought was the link between mind and body. Descartes' world, he felt that mental things had no extension in the world, that they were in kind of another sort of mental substance that wasn't physical. And so that the way that the mental substance communicated to the body was through the pineal gland. We know a lot about the pineal gland today. The pineal gland controls sleep-wake cycling. It produces a hormone called melatonin. Well, it turns out that the pineal gland is actually a mixture between neural tissue and glandular tissue. And information from your eyes passing through the hypothalamus, a part deep in the middle of your brain, also sends some signals back up to the pineal gland. And it's how you use diurnal cycling, the light-dark cycles, to adjust your sleep schedule. So when you fly across the world to someplace that's many, many hours different in terms of timing, it takes a few days to recover. You've got to have sunlight and dark alternating just the right way for your pineal gland to settle in. The pineal gland, as far as we know, plays no significant role in cognition. It's playing a very hormonal control role.
I have one very last thing. So Elon Musk is trying to put circuits and connections into the brain. We can access more memory. Also, we potentially can communicate brain to brain with this type of connection. If we achieve that, what happens?
Implants into the brain will make it capable of people that are quadriplegic to walk and manipulate their arms again. I do think that's possible because we know a lot about the motor signaling in the brain, and that we can record from it, and people can actually train themselves to imagine movements and learn to use these devices. We already know this kind of thing is possible with cochlear implants, people who are deaf, who have nerve damage or have damage to the hair cells of the cochlea, so they're deaf. When a deaf person first gets this implanted, they don't hear sound like you and I do. They hear things that are kind of squawks and squeaks. It doesn't sound like anything that they might have heard when they were hearing before they had the implant. But slowly but surely, they learn to understand it so they can hear speech, so they can interpret your speech and my speech. It won't, for them, sound like yours and mine, but they'll know how to interpret it. Their brains learn to use this abnormal input. That kind of plasticity will make implants for motor control possible. That's because the motor system is organized in a way that is map-like, just like the auditory system is organized in a way that's map-like. But it's totally not the case for language and memory. We have almost no idea. And I want to make this clear. We understand a lot about how brains function, and yet we're still a long ways from getting a real sense of how memories are distributed around the brain, how higher concepts are distributed around the brain. So I think in terms of motor control, the kind of stuff that Elon Musk is doing might well be a boon. The real problem is, of course, not doing damage to the brain while we're trying to get this information out. And that's not been easy to avoid. My suspicion is it's going to be so distributed and fractionated in the brain that it will be very hard to get that information out in a way that can be transferred to another brain that has a different fractionation and distribution of information. That's going to be a really big challenge. I do imagine that the military might be interested in this sort of thing. Why? Because if I can control a limb by thinking about it, I can control a weapon. I can control a jet fighter. And although my ability to sort of think, oh, I want to move my hand, takes a few extra milliseconds. Getting it directly out of the brain is faster. The reaction time could be much, much faster. And so that I think for a variety of those kinds of uses, I think the kind of thing that Elon Musk is doing very likely is going to have a future, but maybe a scary future.
I wanted to thank you, Terry, and I'd like to invite our public to look at his book, Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter, and the other one, The Symbolic Species, the coevolution of language and the brain, is basically about what we have discussed today. So
that's correct.
So thank you, Terry, very much. It's been a great pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thank you.